Excellent. Thank you all for coming. We are really pleased to have Amina Rasul here with us today. She was with us if you were here to some of our events last year when we did our conference on Islam and democracy. She was one of the highlights of that conference, and we were delighted we could have her back in Michigan, although we need to see if we can have this conference in the summer sometime for her benefit. She's now been here during 2 very cold periods. She is the lead convener of the Philippine Council for Islam and Democracy. She's also a columnist for the Manila Times, and she's the author of several publications, including The Road to Peace and Reconciliation, Muslim Perspectives on the Mindanao Conflict, also Broken Peace, an assessment of the 1996 GRP-MNLF Final Peace Agreement, Radicalization of Muslim Communities in Southeast Asia, and Islamic Model for Peace Education. She's a fellow right now of the Strategic Studies Group of the National Defense College of the Philippines, and she's also the managing trustee of the Magbasa Kita Foundation. She has served on presidential cabinets in the Philippines, specifically under Fidel Ramos. She has an MBA from the Asian Institute of Management and an MPA from the Kennedy School at Harvard. And just recently, she was awarded the Muslim Democrat of the Year 2007 by the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy in Washington, D.C. We are so delighted to have her with us today, speaking on From Crisis to Opportunity, Women and Amal. Please join me in welcoming Amina Rasul.
Thank you so much, and good noon to everyone. It's good to be here. I've forgotten what winter's like, but luckily the weather has cooperated a little bit and it's warmed up. So I was actually able to take a 2-hour walk yesterday. Now the Philippines has been, and Muslim Philippines has been under the spotlight again, this time after that horrific massacre that happened last year. So I thought that what I would do would be to take this opportunity that has been given by Susan Walton and Charlie Sullivan to tell you a little bit about what the situation is, where we live after the massacre, because there's been so many things going on. The insurgency has fits and start with the peace process, and now you have this politically motivated massacre. So I thought that's what I would talk to you about today, and at the same time looking at the perspectives of Muslim women and tell you what Muslim women are trying to do about the situation. So this noon I'd like to do 2 things for you. First is to take a look at the crisis situation, developments in the Bangsamoro struggle, looking at the present volatility of the peace and order situation and its effects on women. And then I'd give you the positive news, the rising to seize opportunities and the response of civil society. Basically, we'll take a look at the responses of the Muslim religious, the ulama and the Aleemat, as well as the women civil society organizations. So now, on to crisis. Crisis is a word that my government does not recognize. In 2008, after the fighting between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and government over the non-signing of a Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain, hundreds of thousands became refugees. The European community recognized that there was a humanitarian crisis, but the government said, what crisis? So we'll take a look at the crisis that we have developing in Muslim Mindanao. And first, I will talk to you about the liberation fronts and the Bangsamoro struggle for self-determination. The term Bangsamoro has become accepted as a label for Muslim tribes. Moro actually means Moor. When the Spaniards came in the 15th century, they saw that the Muslims had reached these islands ahead of Christianity, and they called us Moros, Moors. Over time, this term Moro has become very, very negative. But the Liberation Front under Miswari seized the term Moro and made it a political badge of identity. And it is now becoming more and more accepted. So Bangsamoro means the Moro nations. And there are 13 Muslim tribes in the Philippines who call themselves Bangsamoro. That includes my tribe, the Tausug from the islands of Sulu, the Maranaos and the Magindanaos of Central Mindanao. We are now about 5% of the Philippine population and 20% of the population in Mindanao according to census. Now, this is a big debate because Muslims say we are definitely more than 5%, but the census says 5%, and this has impact on allocation of resources. So Muslim groups are saying government is also conducting statistical genocide against the Muslims. Now, the armed conflict, the struggle for self-determination, the Moro Liberation Fronts versus state. The one that started it all was the Moro National Liberation Front. I'll skip the history and just give you the more current developments. The MNLF under Miswari signed finally a peace agreement, which they called the Final Peace Agreement, September 2, 1996. This Final Peace Agreement proposed to provide autonomy, political autonomy to the Muslim South in lieu of independence. So the MNLF accepted that. Part of the peace agreement also provided for allocation of resources so that the Muslim South could get out of the poverty situation it was in and catch up with the rest of Mindanao. Unfortunately, that did not happen. The final peace agreement is under review right now. There's a tripartite review under the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Now, what about the Moro Islamic Liberation Front? The MILF is a splinter group of the MNLF. The founder of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Salamat Hashim, was a religious leader. He did not exactly agree with Miswari's more secular ideology. He wanted an Islamic state. So he got out of the MNLF and established the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Peace process has been ongoing in fits and starts between government and the MILF, but at least the MILF is still engaged in peace process. Now, with status. As I mentioned earlier, the MNLF the MNLF peace agreement is undergoing review by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, government, and the Liberation Front itself. What has been going on with the MNLF? From 2001 to 2008, there have been fighting between MNLF groups and government. But you don't really know about this because it is not identified as fights between MNLF and government. Instead, it's always labeled as, not insurgency, it's labeled as terrorism. It's a fight between government and the Abu Sayyaf linked with Al-Qaeda, which therefore gave strong justification for the war on terror to be also fought in southern Philippines. Gave the justification for support of the Balikatan. This is a military joint venture between your government and my government, supposedly to strengthen my military's approach towards fighting terrorism. But most of the fights that have been classified as terrorist encounters were really not. There were encounters sometimes with MLF groups who went back to the mountain following the arrest of their chairman, Miswari, in 2001 over charge of rebellion. I will not go into the history of that, but suffice it to say, Miswari was released last year, found innocent of the charge of rebellion, and found innocent because they had no evidence, which led most of the Muslim organizations to believe that the charges against Miswari were politically motivated. So that's the MNLF. At least they're trying to review the peace agreement to find out how to get back to effective implementation of the 1996 peace agreement. The MILF is more problematic. We thought that everything had been smoothed out, that we were on our way to having a major peace agreement with the MILF. But unfortunately, in August 2008, just when we were to sign a Memorandum of Agreement of Ancestral Domain, which would have resolved issues of over who controls natural resources, the domain of the areas of the Muslim tribes, the Supreme Court of the Philippines stopped the signing of the peace agreement. Catholic leaders from the north opposed, very, very vocal. The language were really intended to inflame passions. So the Supreme Court made a decision that the Memorandum of Agreement would not be signed, in spite of the fact that it had been initialed already by the facilitator, which was Malaysia, by the MILF, and by government. Now, the MILF believes since it had been initialed, under law, it is already an agreement. Never mind that it was not signed formally. Be that as it may, August 4, 2008, fighting broke up because of the non-signing of the agreement. 600,000, over 600,000 Mindanaoans, mostly Muslim, became refugees overnight, and hundreds were killed or injured. Human rights violations started piling up, and conflict again became a marked situation in Muslim Mindanao. Now, luckily for us, over the last year, the international community has been helping. They've been helping the Malaysians who are facilitating the peace agreement. There is now an international contact group that has been created to help support the peace process, and this includes the United Kingdom, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. It includes NGOs like the Asia Foundation and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as well as a group called Conciliation Resources. That is the Liberation Front, the political fight for self-determination. That is following a certain track. That is being covered by international groups and is highlighted. It is the second reason, the second causes of crisis, of armed conflicts, that's more problematic. The general volatility of the peace and order situation, political violence, clan feuds, loose firearms. There's supposed to be 150,000 loose firearms in Mindanao, in Muslim Mindanao. Banditry, kidnap for ransom, narcopolitics. This is the more problematic. Let's now go to political violence. What happened during the Ampatuan Massacre. Now, Ampatuan is not just the name of the suspect. It is also the name of the town where it happened. In November, 57 people, 22 of them women, and 2 of those women pregnant, were brutally murdered. This would have been glossed over by now, if not for the fact that 32 of the victims were media. And because 32 of the victims were journalists and practitioners of media, the condemnation was global. And this is a massacre that will not be allowed to disappear unless it is resolved. The accused is Mayor Andal Ampatuan Jr. and his father, Governor Andal Ampatuan Sr., who are very close allies of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. The Maguindanao Massacre, well, actually people don't like it being termed Maguindanao Massacre. They want it to be called Ampatuan Massacre, not just because of the suspect, but because it happened in Ampatuan town. This massacre was the reason for state of emergency to be imposed in the area of the Maguindanao province and 2 surrounding provinces as well. December 1, the Department of Justice finally charged Andal Jr. with 25 counts of murder. For a while, there was a feeling that the national leaders, that Mrs. Arroyo and her party, might try to do something to protect the Ampatuans. In fact, the spokesperson of the president, Lorelai Fajardo, who has since been fired, it seems, said just because this situation happened, it doesn't mean that the president would turn her back on the Ampatuans. And after she made that statement, and there was a hue and cry over that particular statement, she sort of disappeared into the background. Anyway, martial law was declared after the state of emergency was imposed, and the reason given was that there was a state of rebellion, which made everybody wonder, what state of rebellion? These were close allies of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Now, just because they are trying to prevent arrest, they are now in a state of rebellion. The declaration of martial law forced Congress to do congressional hearings. Both Senate and Congress came together for a week of discussions to talk about martial law, whether it was legal, whether it was legitimate, whether it was constitutional or not. Government did not allow, the executive did not allow the congressional hearings to prosper. Instead, they stopped the implementation of martial law after 7 days. The massacre itself exposed a pattern of democracy deficits. Not only did it show the political violence, but it also highlighted the causes, the factors that made this political violence so abhorrent and widespread: warlordism, patronage politics, and clearly the wanton disregard of rule of law in Muslim Mindanao. Why did this political violence make such an impact nationally? It is because of the close relationship between Mrs. Arroyo and the Ampatuans. Mrs. Arroyo's election in 2004 has always been contested, and over time, more and more people believe that she did cheat. And most of her votes came from Maguindanao province, which at the time was already ruled by Governor Andal Ampatuan. Now, I have to tell you that in the Muslim provinces, the more popular candidate was the opponent of Mrs. Arroyo, an actor named Fernando Po Jr. He had played the Muslim, a Muslim datu, very, very sympathetically. So the Muslims loved him. In fact, if there would be a movie of Fernando Po Jr. in the provinces, and there would be a bad guy trying to shoot Fernando Po Jr. from behind, the Muslims would shout, and some of them who had guns would shoot at the bad guy. That is how well-loved the opponent was. So for him to lose so heavily to Mrs. Arroyo in the Muslim provinces was unbelievable. And true enough, when they did the surveys, cheating during the 2004 elections, Mindanao said, yes, we believe there was serious cheating, and 58% said, yes, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo cheated. So you can see now that there is a very, very close relationship between Mrs. Arroyo and the Ampatuans. Not only does she owe them for the elections, but if this is true, then she has to do something to make sure that the loyalty, the relationship will remain. So you have serious problems with the liberation fronts, and this is now complicated by the fact that there is really ineffective government action on political violence, ordinary criminality, community-based violence, clan violence, for instance. And you have the human rights violations that are happening all over, whether political, social, or economic violence, human rights violence. So you ask, what of the women and the children? Conflict plus other factors make the situation very oppressive in the areas of the armed conflict. You have human rights problems faced by women, not just because they're women in areas of conflict, but because they're Muslims. Poverty, poor education and very, very low literacy rates, bad health indicators. I'll just run by some slides for you. Poorest of the poor. In spite of the fact that there's a 1996 peace agreement that guaranteed there would be resources to make Muslim Mindanao catch up, ARMM has remained since 1996 poorest of the poor. From 2000, 2003, 2006, hasn't changed. We are ranked number one. When you look at human development indicators, all the 5 provinces of the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao is always in the bottom 10 among provinces in the Philippines. When you look at basic and functional literacy, the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao always has the highest illiteracy rates for men and for women. But interestingly enough, the ratio for women is worse in Muslim Mindanao than it is for any other region. Health. Lowest access to potable water, shortest life expectancy in the country, very poor ratio of hospital beds to population. It has the highest maternal death rates, and the highest infant mortality rates. ARMM has been dubbed as the most dangerous region in the Philippines for mothers and women about to give birth. So that is the situation that we have in Muslim Mindanao. Conflict-affected, poorest of the poor, lawless. It is such a depressing condition to be in. So people expect that most of the citizens have just given up, and that this situation of weak rule of law, conflict will continue. Luckily, civil society, ordinary citizens have started to come together to say, enough already. If national government is not going to do anything about it, we will. And what I'd like to do now is to share some of the initiatives that have been ongoing for ordinary Muslims to seize back, take back their life and take back their communities. The massacre actually, as bad as it was, helped in a way because it generated such tremendous public outrage that even the most ordinary of citizens felt that something had to be done. The question is, will this public outrage continue to generate enough stimulus so that real reforms can happen? First response, the Muslim religious. Now, the Constitution of the Philippines says there's separation of church and state. But actually, this is fudged most of the time. If you go to government buildings, they have masses, they have statues of the Virgin Mary, and they have crucifixes all over the place. We don't really mind, we Muslims. We only mind that there's not a same space for us. But in Islam, there is no separation between church and state. However, the ulama rarely interfere in political decisions, which we found very strange. So we started working with the ulama, the Muslim religious scholars, and over the past 3 years, we have helped them organize a national network, which they call the National Ulama Conference of the Philippines. They, in their organizational structure, are unique in the sense that they have provided 2 seats for the Aleemat, or the women. And this is a situation you will not find, not even in very, very progressive Indonesia. During the summit, the 3rd summit of the National Ulama Conference of the Philippines, which we held a week ago in Davao, the Muslim religious agreed to partner with major national institutions so that they can do something about the problems that I had listed to you earlier. They have agreed to partner with a group called the Parish Pastoral Council for Responsible Voting for election monitoring and voters education. Now, PPCRV is the only accredited organization accredited by the Commission on Elections to do monitoring during the next May elections. The Muslim religious have also agreed to partner with the Philippine Commission on Human Rights to monitor human rights violations and to educate the population on human rights. What about the women? As early as the 60s, Filipino women have actually started working in civil society. You would have the regular groups or optimists at the time. Those of you who are familiar with the JCs, they would have the JC-rettes. The Rotary would have the Rotarians. So even the Muslim women were active in that. However, women started to go into different kinds of organizing work because of the armed conflicts that affected us. So Muslim women organizations started developing so that they could address peace and they could address the need for families to be kept safe and to start lobbying against the lack of access to programs that would allow them to keep their families safe. The oldest known Muslim women's organization in Mindanao was actually established by my mother, so in 1968. So you could just imagine, I was just in college and was already a member of an activist Muslim women's organization. Now, interestingly enough, the liberation fronts also have strong women's organizations. And after the signing of the 1996, the MNLF women put up the Moro Women's Foundation. And this Women's Foundation was provided grants by USAID and other institutions to help reach out to families in the affected communities. And they would do things like livelihood training. They established hundreds of small cooperatives. And then on July 1997, the MNLF women lobbied with the regional government, the armed regional government, to establish a regional commission for Bangsamoro women. So this is the government policy-making institution in ARMM for Muslim women. Unfortunately, they're very ill-resourced, and if any of you have any interest in doing research on women's issues, Muslim women's issues, maybe you can also look at how you can help this regional commission for the Bangsamoro women. Muslim women peace advocates since then have started to grow in number. They have focused on networking for peace building, electoral reforms, human rights. Recently, we launched a group called the Nurus Salam, a network of Muslim women religious called the Aleemat, and women civil society leaders. And it is this group that I would like to discuss with you a little bit. Nurus Salam means light of peace in Arabic. As I mentioned earlier, the National Ulama Conference of the Philippines gave 2 seats for the Aleemat. And when we started working with the Aleemat, there were 33 of them last January. They wanted help in networking. They wanted to do something more. As it turned out, the Aleemat basically have the same educational background as the ulama. But whereas the ulama have a leading role to play because they're the ones who do the sermons, the khutbah in the masjid, the Aleemat don't really have a role to play. In spite of the fact that most of the teachers in the Islamic schools, in the madrasa, are the Aleemat. So they asked us to help them organize, and we've been doing that the whole of last year. Finally, they decided they would have a network, but a network not just of the Muslim women religious, but they have now linked with women civil society organizations, and they called their group Nurus Salam. They came up with a declaration, their intention, what they want to do. And there were 5 topics, themes that they focused on: peace, financial independence, education, health, clean and honest elections, and governance. On peace, they said they want capacity building. They want access to education, gender empowerment, and human rights. They wanted a network of Muslim women peace builders. They wanted government and everybody else to look at the situation of the refugees and make sure that they're cared for. They called for implementation of the 1996 peace agreement and they called for full support for the peace process. On financial independence, they are asking for opportunities and training for employment and livelihood. They want access to credit and capital, but they want Islamic credit, Islamic finance. They want access to markets. On education, they want literacy. The highest illiteracy rate is in Muslim Mindanao. And the Muslim women have a higher rate for illiteracy than the Muslim men. Whereas at the national level, the women actually have a higher literacy rate. So there's something very screwed up in Muslim Mindanao. And since it is the mothers who will help the children to do well in school or to go to school, if the women are illiterate, who's going to help the children in the field of education? So this is a serious concern. They want access to formal and non-formal education, and they want to establish women's resource centers. They want to do parenting. They want to do counseling for children, youth who are in conflict with law. They want to do something about prostitution. And this was an issue that they were not quite so comfortable with, but they said we have to bring it out in the open, because they said, even if the men, even if our ulama will not admit to it, we know that prostitution is happening because our women cannot support their families. So they are selling the only thing that they have, and it is themselves. So they want to do something about this particular problem. Health. They want access to services. The Muslim Mindanao is the least served region in the Philippines in terms of health. They want the simplest thing in the world, drinking water, safe drinking water. They want sanitation. They want a campaign against substance abuse, drug rehabilitation. Now, on clean and honest elections and governance, they want voters' education, and they want to monitor the elections themselves. They are calling for more participation of women in governance, in policy making, and they want a stronger implementation of the Code of Muslim Personal Laws. Now, maybe another time we can have a discussion about the Code of Muslim Personal Laws, because although there are items there which are discriminatory against women, but still the Code of Muslim Personal Laws does provide women with certain rights which cannot be violated by Muslim men with regards to inheritance or divorce and alimony. So the Aleemat, the Muslim women religious, have decided they want a role for themselves in the community. And what they want is to become agents in transforming their communities. And this is how they phrased it. Transform communities in terms of conflict resolution, human rights, electoral reforms, livelihood, sustainable development, organizational and leadership development. That's what they want. It's a tall order, but I think these women can do it. They, after the massacre, came together with civil society organizations and the Muslim religious, the ulama, and they thought it is time to have a grassroots approach to reform. Moral reawakening, they said, is crucial. And they decided to call it Amal, which means hope, or if it is spelled another way, maybe our Arab brothers and Arabic-speaking brothers and sisters here might be able to discuss this a little bit more. If it is written in a certain way, Amal also means action. Which brings me now to an important development in Muslim Mindanao. So civil society, the religious are coming together to do something about the situation, to start a grassroots level approach to reform. After the massacre, Governor Ampatuan, the father, who was governor of Maguindanao, was also charged with collusion in the murders, and so had to be taken out. The government appointed a young woman, Nariman Amboloddo. Now, Nariman was elected board member of a new province called Sharif Kabungsuan. This is a very weird situation. Governor Andal Ampatuan, the old man, the one who's a very good friend of Mrs. Arroyo, decided to divide his province in half so that the opposition could just fight each other in one part and leave him alone, so that the Maguindanao province, there would be an area there only for the Ampatuans. And that's not a joke. 44 Ampatuans are actually elected or appointed in the province of Maguindanao. The Supreme Court said the creation of that new province, Sharif Kabungsuan, is illegal. So all of those elected, including Nariman, who was elected #1 board member, suddenly found they had no jobs in spite of the fact that they were elected. So the regional government appointed all of the board members as board members and put them back in Maguindanao province. Now, since Nariman was elected #1 in that particular district, government appointed her as acting governor. This we see as a positive step. It allows us to move forward because Nariman is very strong in civil society. The very first thing she did was to call the Commission on Audit to come down to Maguindanao, open up all the books, and just check what was missing. How were expenses, how was money spent by Maguindanao? Interestingly enough, the Commission on Audit has not really moved that fast in checking and doing the audits. But Nariman is starting a process. She says she has 6 months, and she did not file for election, which makes her a perfect candidate for acting governor. She says she wants rays of hope to be brought back to the community. She wants the people to feel government actually works to serve them. So she's doing everything right, reaching out to civil society, reaching out to communities, fully supported by civil society. Unfortunately, since election is coming up, Nariman is not the best person in place if you're looking for 20,000, 50,000 easy votes. So now there is a challenge to Nariman, and there are moves, manipulations now to get her out and to put somebody else in place, somebody more traditional. So these are the challenges that we face now. We have serious problems in Muslim Mindanao, not just because of the fights between the liberation fronts and government, but because of breakdown of rule of law. We have human rights violations. In spite of that, we have got groups coming together to do something about the situation and help us find our way back to peace. We have a young woman who can be the trigger for reform in a province that used to be seen as no man's land. But there's serious challenge to her. Traditional politics is rearing its head in Maguindanao to push back a new type of politics. And it is at this point in time that we need to look at forming alliances, informing the world outside about what's going on in Southern Philippines, the fragility of the reform movement, if you will, that's beginning to come together in Muslim Mindanao. As a last statement, let me just talk about the word ina. Now, for the Filipinos here, ina means mother. And interestingly enough, that's Nariman's nickname, Ina. The former governor of Maguindanao was called Ama, or father. In fact, Mrs. Arroyo would publicly call him father, just to acknowledge how close the relationship was. So the people in Maguindanao say they have been delivered from the Ama to the Ina, and they prefer the nurturing embrace of the Ina. So I hope that you can help us pass on the word that in Muslim Mindanao, changes are happening, but the changes are very fragile. And it requires nurturing, not just by the communities themselves, but their friends from outside. So thank you very much, and any questions?
One question. Can you, with elections coming up, can you tell us anything about how the Moro Mindanao is lining up in terms of presidential contenders and what how, if any, the massacre has affected sort of the alignment of different groups behind different presidential candidates?
Well, interestingly enough, the Muslim Mindanaoans, according to surveys, are following the national trend. And the national trend is for the son of the former president, the late President Corazon C. Aquino, Noynoy. Noynoy is very popular, even in Muslim Mindanao. His running mate, Mar Rojas, in spite of the fact that he was one of those who really clobbered us on the Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain, is also benefiting from the popularity of Noynoy Aquino and has come up with high rates in the surveys. But it's early days yet. According to the last survey, the gap between Noynoy Aquino for president and that of his closest rival, Senator Manny Villar, is closing, in spite of the fact that there are serious allegations of impropriety on the part of Senator Villar in terms of public construction of roads that were built to go through his real estate properties. We think that this hoopla is really being generated by those who do not want Manny Villar to win the elections. But in spite of that, the gap is closing. So as of today, Noynoy Aquino is the favorite all over the country, but Villar is catching up. The candidate of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, his name is Gilbert Chodoro, former Secretary of Defense, is a very good candidate, brilliant young man. Unfortunately, he's Gloria's candidate.
I have a question that's a little bit outside of the focus of your talk, but I think it's really important to understanding the fragility of the situation as you describe it, especially in the wake of the Ampatuan Massacre. And that is, if you could say a little bit more about the history of clan identity and rivalry. It's something that I know very little about historically, and I've always been curious to what extent the clan rivalry, especially as it seems to have come out in the most recent episodes of political violence, to what extent do they come out of a much more recent history of, Christian militias and other groups that are fighting in the South? And also, what is the place of women in those rivalries, or do they tend to be pretty much male-dominated political contestations?
Well, the role of women. Before the massacre, women have always had a special role to play in Muslim Mindanao, especially with regards to conflict resolution. So generally, women would try to mediate between feuding clans. Now that's a little bit endangered, because in the last violence, this is what happened. The opponent of Ampatuan Jr., his name was Toto Mangudadatu. He knew that no one would touch the women. So he sent his wife, his sister, his female relatives, his cousins, to file his certificate of candidacy for him for governor. Didn't work. So the massacre of these women has really hit us hard in Muslim Mindanao. The status of women has been endangered. Now, you're asking about the situation of clan conflict. This is not peculiar to Muslim Mindanao. Anywhere in the Philippines you go, in the rural areas where rule of law has been shaky, after martial law, you will find strong clans, whether Catholic or indigenous people or Muslim. And these clans, we thought their hold on power would have been neutralized when President Aquino became president. Did not. it was easier for those running for national office to strike alliances with strong clans in exchange for votes. So it has been a very insidious relationship between clans and politics. Now it has been brought to the surface. If you look at the elections in the Philippines over the last 8 years, you will see a very disturbing trend where the governor, the mayor, the vice governor all come from the same family. And this is true not just for Muslim provinces. In the city, Makati City, the premier city, the elite city in the Philippines, mayor is Binay, the councilor is Binay, and in the coming elections, the mayor, the vice mayor, the congresswoman is going to be Binay. Davao City, the strongest city economically in Mindanao, Christian city. The mayor is the mayor, the vice mayor, all the same family. So the clans are getting stronger because the democratization has not really embedded itself in our communities. And I think this is the challenge to those in civil society who want to do reforms. They have to look at how to now neutralize, how to, in a way, disrupt this strengthening of families and clans in politics. The Constitution says there will be no dynasties in Philippine government. But since the Congress will not pass an anti-dynasty law that would have implementing regulations, dynasties are getting stronger. In fact, I blame my mother. She was senator. She should have made me congresswoman.
Please talk a little bit about what the traditional relationship between the ulama and the Aleemat is. I mean, assumption that the ulama should have much more power, but was it strange that the Aleemat then established this Nurus Salam organization, and did the ulama feel resentment, or were there the resistance to the Aleemat taking this role?
Well, so far, not yet. So far, so good. We started working with the ulama 3 years ago. And when we started our consultations with them, we always asked them if they could bring the Aleemat to the talks. And they did. Now, half of the Aleemat who are part of our group are wives of the ulama. So that helps. But having said that, realize that the Aleemat have the same educational background as the ulama. So they have the capacity. And they teach in the madrasa, which makes them influential. The women, when we had our consultations with them, were very clear that what they wanted was to complement the work of the ulama. That is why they focused on those areas. Because they said what is important for us is that within the National Ulama Conference of the Philippines, there will be a group that will work on the interests of women, children, and families. But when you look at the interest of children, women, and families, that is the interest that should be supported if you want stronger democracy. You're talking about financial independence, which therefore means autonomy. You're talking about education. You're talking about delivery of public services. You're talking about supporting peace processes. But the women's approach have been non-confrontational, and it's working very well. So in barely a year's time, the women have managed to work much faster than the men. It's been 3 years working with the ulama. Finally came up with a national network. We've been working with the Aleemat for 9 months. Not only do they have a national network, but they actually have started implementing projects on their own. So there is a complementarity here between the work of the Aleemat and the ulama. So at this point in time, I can honestly say there are no rivalries. But then ask me that question again in 5 years.
I think a lot of Americans and non-Muslims would be interested in knowing that half of the teachers or so at madrasas are women. That's, I think, not the vision that we have. And you said that they have similar educational backgrounds and levels, but is there a sort of gendered division of labor inside the madrasas? Are there things that women tend to teach and men tend to teach? We won't get into equal pay for equal work, but are there sorts of issues and places that seem to be within that world, women's concerns of teaching and men's concerns of teaching? And I'm also assuming that there are both male and female students at these madrasas, but could you fill me in on that as well?
Yeah. Generally, when you're talking about religious education in the madrasa, in the Philippines, there's really not that much of a division of labor. Our madrasas generally are elementary to high school. So when you go to college, that is when they start really dividing the kids. But at the levels of the majority of the madrasa, there's really not much division of the students. Now, do the women have differentiated roles? Yes. Most of in fact, all of the Aleemat, their main roles within the community, the organization of the ulama, is supportive. So they're the ones who make sure that there's food at the meetings, the venue is fine, and they do all of these things. But when the meeting comes, they have no voice. They are in the background. That is the situation in the South, between the ulama and the Aleemat. So this thing that we're doing, this organizing work that we're doing with the ulama conference and with the Aleema, is in many ways pretty revolutionary. And we have Aleemat who are very vocal and very aggressive. And to my surprise, the ulama don't seem to mind. They let the women speak, and no one's gotten hurt yet.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk about the role of the Muslim women in the peace process and everything else that's happening in the Arm region. I'm curious, though, if there was no massacre, would there have been a process, or would there have been an organization that was organized? My point is, surely there were groups that were working towards the betterment of that particular region even before the massacre. Could you tell us a little bit about those women in particular, Christian as well as Muslim women?
The massacre happened November last year. And somewhere in the presentation, I had noted that the first Muslim women's organization was actually established in the 80s. So on record, that's the first. There are many women's organizations that have surfaced in Mindanao, but it's the Muslim civil society that's really wanting. We have a lot of ground to cover in order to be able to catch up with our brothers and sisters from the Christian side. This work that we're doing with the ulama started long before the massacre. We started working with them 2007. And when the massacre happened, they very quickly came together and made a decision to do something, because they said it cannot be status quo. Something has got to be done. So the word that they seized on was hope, Amal. And we are really hoping that this particular initiative, very, very fragile initiative, will take root, and that the ulama will be able to carry this idea into their communities through the mosque and through the madrasa, and help our communities find their way out of the situation we're in. If we believe, if the ulama and the Aleemat can be responsible, for instance, just for education, educating people that they have rights, educating people that they have to participate in political processes, do not sell your vote. I mean, think about it. If our ulama can work like the Catholic priest and have community outreach programs. That's a positive step because no one does that outside of civil society in Muslim Mindanao. And civil society organizations largely are just in the capital towns. They're not in the villages up in the mountains. So we are hoping and we're supporting the ulama and the Aleemat as they try now to find a way to be able to spread this moral reawakening movement that they think should happen in Muslim Mindanao.
Do you think it can be sustained? Is there an infrastructure that would make it possible to sustain such movement?
Well, as the ulama will say, inshallah. But we think I think it can happen. For one, they have come together. This is the first time that Muslim religious organizations have come together. The National Ulama Conference of the Philippines at this point in time have 150 Muslim religious organizations who have applied for membership. So we're not talking about individual ulama, we're talking about organizations here. So who knows? We're trying to find ways of supporting this ulama organization and the Nurus Salam because we think this is where investments will pay off. Peace dividends can really come out of investments in the work of the Muslim religious.
Would your training with the ulama and the Aleemats would be different from each of the group that is the Muslim group? Meaning to say, would it change from Maguindanao ethnic group to a Tausug or to a Maranao group?
Well, it shouldn't.
Between the three would really be evident on those kinds of stuff, don't you?
Yeah. When we started work putting together this network, we've had 3 summits so far. In the first summit, the coordinators of the different groups said, well, you know, we're different languages, different customs. Maybe it's better if the rooming arrangement would be by tribe. And we said, okay, don't rock the boat, fine, by tribes. But in the third summit, the rooming arrangements was now intertribal. Because the point that we made was, you're talking about unity here. How can you talk about unity if you cannot room with each other? So interestingly enough, the ulama agreed, and I think they had a relatively good time rediscovering their common links. So you have islander and mountain tribe coming together, and we had no problems. But there's a long way to go in terms of bringing the Muslim religious together. Because think about it, 13 different tribes. And we are divided not just by tribes, but also by what school the ulama studied in. So if you were from Egypt, from Al-Azhar, you sort of congregated together. And if you were from Saudi Arabia, you would have a slightly different interpretation. If you are from Pakistan, again, different. And if you were educated in the Philippines, in the Islamic schools, then everybody else looked down on you because you're local.
I think it's a very enlightening talk. What I'm wondering about is, you know, you mentioned that the MNLF has a women's wing, and with, you know, the characterization you're giving of Nurus Salam, you know, it's the new kid on the block of a very dynamic force, and is hoping to make changes by pulling influence from all quarters of society, the ulamas and women. Just wondering, you know, in particular, what do groups like the MNLF's women's wing see this as a threat to their influence? And also, related to that, you know, in what ways do ulamas start to see a new kind of pull in terms of influence? I mean, I think they've been very caught in this conflict, being asked to throw their support behind various groups, the MNLF and the MILF, and now this one. I mean, what new kind of conflicts are being created in this way?
Well, technically, the MNLF and the MILF do not have women's wings, but they do have organized groups of women who support the cause. So, for instance, Ms. Wari's wife, Ruwaida, was the acknowledged leader of the MNLF women. You're asking if they feel threatened by the Nurus Salam group. Well, no. For one, Nurus Salam is still very new and trying its wings. It is a group of religious and Muslim civil society organizations. And within the ulama group, which means also within the Aaleemat group, we have links with all sectors. So we have ulama and alima who are with the MNLF, ulama and alima who are with the MILF. We have ulama who are chaplains in the military. We have ulama who work with government. So we made absolutely sure that when this group started forming, they would represent all sectors of the community, because we know full well if you don't, then that becomes dangerous. We even have rival ulama organizations come together. In the previous years, the strongest ulama organization in Mindanao was a group called the Ulama League of the Philippines. And their rival organization was called Shabab. Both groups, the leaders of both groups are now with this National Ulama Conference of the Philippines. So as long as they focus on common ground, on common issues, then we're going to be fine. And we need to choose our battles very carefully. Let's not get into controversies that could divide the group. So peace, financial independence, health, those are motherhood statements, in effect, that no one is going to debate. So the center is holding for now.
Thank you for this talk. I had one question for you. I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit to the history of the concept of Amal in Philippines, both as a religious concept and kind of the moral valence of it, and then also how it is or is not getting mobilized now in terms of religious and civic action. Where I do my research in Indonesia, it is kind of considered more in the latter definition that you gave, kind of as action and almost as a good deed. And in some of the religious groups I've been working with, the Muslim groups, it's kind of been mapped on to deeds for the nation as well. And so it's kind of used in a different context. And I was wondering if you could speak to that concept of Amal as hope in the Philippines and the history of the concept a little bit, and then how the women leaders are, or perhaps if they are, rallying around that concept and trying to mobilize that for both political and religious action. Thank you again.
This idea of a moral reawakening movement really came to fore because of the massacre. Before the massacre happened, November last year, the ulama organizations and the Aaleemat were coming together really to look at what they could do to help with peace and development in their communities. So it was very broad. We have been in such conflict situation for such a long time that people sort of took it easy in the crafting of the organizing, which is why it took us 3 years before the National Ulama Conference of the Philippines could have its first regular elections and so on and so forth. But after the massacre, then it was like fire was lit, and people realized that you needed to do something very quickly now. And that is why they came up with the term Amal. They know that it's not going to be easy, but if you could give hope to the communities, then at least you're taking the right step. And what they thought they could do first was to start with the powers that they had. And they have the power of reaching the people through the khutbah, the sermons in the mosque every Friday. And they had the power of influence because of the Islamic schools. So I guess the challenge to them now is how do they use the powers that they have in order to be able to help bring Islamic values back into the homes. The feeling of many is that the Ampatuan Massacre and all of these criminalities that we've been oppressed with really is happening because the Muslim populations have lost their way and they have lost their Islamic values. So now the ulama are saying we need to get that back. And when you talk about the Islamic values, we discussed it with them, and what are you basically talking about? You're talking about justice, you're talking about rights. In fact, they came up with a acronym, jihad. They want to reclaim jihad. The greater jihad is the struggle to perfect yourself. The lesser jihad is the waging war to protect family, faith, community. In the greater jihad, this is what they mean. J is for justice. I is for integrity, H is for honesty, harmony, A is for accountability, and D is for dignity, democracy, and one other. Development. So they came up with this acronym. And if they hold together, this National Ulama Conference of the Philippines and Nurus-Salam. And if they can strengthen their networking, then I think you have a very good force here that can promote the greater jihad, which is very positive, because then I can say jihadist and not fear that I'm going to be picked up by the Homeland Security.
You will anyway.
Oh, yeah. We were thinking of creating a T-shirt, and it would say, I'm a jihadist for. And you could write it, whatever it is. I'm a jihadist for the environment. I'm a jihadist for, I don't know, whatever.
Anyone else? So thank you, Amina, very much for...
You're most welcome, and thank you.